Let me kick it off. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, for joining us today. This webinar titled "Demand Digital Innovation for Agriculture: Use of Technology and Data to Aggregate Retail Demand in African Cities," learning from Twiga Foods in Kenya, is part of the World Bank's Data-Driven and Digital Agriculture webinar series. So in this series, we invite innovators, thought leaders, and World Bank team leaders who are transforming agriculture and food systems using data-driven and digital agriculture. My name is Shobha Shetty. I'm the practice manager for food and agriculture in the Africa region, and I cover South and East Africa. So I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Peter Njonjo, the co-founder and chief executive officer of Twiga Foods Limited. Peter, I'm not sure if you recall, but actually we met in your offices in March. So I think that was actually my last trip, outside of DC. So when we met with you and your management team, and I also had the opportunity to visit a Twiga pack house. So I'm delighted to see you at least on the screen now, and to have you share with us sort of your experiences. Also, a very warm welcome to Wale Aini, the Senior Investment Officer and Regional Head for Africa Venture Capital from the International Finance Corporation, IFC. He has been one of the primary drivers in the growth of Twiga Foods in Kenya. So the World Bank, just a few words of introduction before we get started with Peter's presentation. The World Bank, with support from the Korea World Bank Partnership Facility, conducted a study on the agri-technology ecosystem of Africa. This study, which is resulted in a final report, Scaling Up Disruptive Agricultural Technologies in Africa. I hope that's up on the screen. Yes, very good. So this was sort of came to fruition this June. So we are all, and the team, I'm very proud of the team that worked on this. So this include also a pilot intervention in Kenya, and it aimed to further the state of knowledge about the emerging trend of disruptive agriculture technologies in Africa. So this report actually identified 434 existing DAT operations, and further analysis revealed that about 194 were scalable, and of which about 70% are digital. The disruptive is also digital. And in Kenya in particular, the World Bank organized a conference on disruptive agricultural technologies, including a challenge competition to identify Kenya's most promising agri-tech innovations, with the aim of bringing 1 million Kenyan farmers onto an impactful digital platform over the next 3 years. Intending to build public and private sector capacity within the DAT, the Disruptive Agriculture Technology Ecosystem in Kenya, the World Bank Group, in collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Fisheries of the Government of Kenya, competitively selected a cohort of 14 agri-tech startups last April to provide capacity building, mentorship, and acceleration support. So since then, the World Bank team has facilitated formal partnerships between 16 county governments and these 14 startups to really provide digital services across several agriculture value chains, covering specific aspects of productivity enhancement, access to financial services, data analytics, and access to markets. So these counties are now implementing 2 bank projects, World Bank financed IDA projects, the Kenya Climate Smart Agriculture Project, which we call KSAP, and the National Agriculture Rural Inclusive Growth Project, also known as the NARIG, with a cumulative investment of almost $500 million US. And these investments are being made on the ground through the projects to complement the digital services provided by these agri-tech startups to really provide these farmers the means to enhance their productivity and profitability. So we currently have about 150,000 farmers, and the plan is to cover about, as I said, 1 million farmers in the next 3 years. So we have identified several possible areas of convergence with Twiga. I know our team in Kenya has been in discussions with the Twiga team. So through these two bank projects, the KSAP and the NARIG, we are very keen to partner with Twiga to really sort of better access the market for our farmers who are covered under these two projects. For Twiga, we believe the possible partnership will enable them to have a reliable and predictable access to specific commodities like potatoes or mangoes or avocados of the required quality directly from the farmer producer organizations. And the bank funded projects then will provide the technical assistance, the leverage digital technologies, and put in all the required investments, especially on the public goods side, to really look at the productivity and aggregation aspects so that they can be reliable suppliers to Twiga. So we hope that we can start such a partnership, at least in a few counties for specific commodities, and then scale that up subsequently. Okay, so let me now go forward to introducing the speakers and the discussants. And before that, I just wanted to also mention the webinar series is available on the World Bank's Open Learning Campus, and the participants can also find the link at the bottom of the announcement. So let me start with our speaker, Peter. It's great to see you. Peter is the co-founder and serves as the CEO of Twiga Foods Limited. He's a native of Kenya, and Peter holds an MBA in Strategic Management and undergraduate degree in International Business Administration from the US International University in Kenya, and an executive leadership program from the Harvard Business School. Peter is also a certified public accountant and spent 21 years with the Coca-Cola Company, with his last role being president of the West and Central Africa Business Unit, made up of 33 countries based in Lagos, Nigeria. Peter was president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Kenya, a director of the American Business Council in Kenya, and has been voted among the top 100 young leaders in Africa by Forbes Afrique and top 40 under 40 by the Business Daily in Kenya. He currently also serves on the Global Board of Junior Achievement and is the vice chair of the COVID Advisory Board to the ICT Ministry in Kenya. Our discussants, we have a very impressive panel of discussants. Let me start with Wale Aeni, who leads the Africa focus of IFC's venture capital practice. The IFC, of course, is part of the World Bank Group, and IFC's venture capital team invests in technology companies in venture frontier markets. Wale has a global technology experience spanning several roles, including venture capital, investment banking, corporate development, and microprocessor and ASIC chip design. Prior to the IFC, Wale led venture capital early stage investments in disruptive startups across various technology sectors for Orange in Silicon Valley, with representative investments in the US, including PayJoy in fintech, Veniam, Mesh Networks, Chain, blockchain, and in virtual reality. He also led transactions on behalf of Echo VC, an early stage Pan-African tech fund in Hotels.ng and Printivo. Wale started his finance career with JP Morgan's Technology Investment Banking Group in San Francisco, where he successfully executed over 12 billion worth of closed transactions, spanning mergers and acquisitions to IPOs for large cap technology clients, including Facebook, Electronic Arts, Activision Blizzard, Intel Corp, AMD, Shutterfly, etc. Wale started his career as an engineer, and his previous technology career, Wale was a microprocessor design engineer with Intel Corp, where he led critical aspects of Intel's CSI chip architecture, the biggest microarchitecture change in Intel's history. Wale has an MBA from Dartmouth College and a bachelor's degree with distinguished Red Diploma from Moscow University. He's a Kaufman Venture Capital Fellow and a recipient of the Top Global 100 Rising Stars Award in Corporate Venture. Welcome to Wale and Peter. We also have our very own from the Agriculture and Food GP, Christopher Brett, who's our lead agribusiness specialist, who joined the World Bank in 2016. Chris has a master's degree in management for agricultural development from Cranfield University in the UK. He has more than 30 years of experience of working within the public and private and voluntary sectors in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Before coming to the World Bank, he worked for 9 years as the global head of sustainability for a large multinational agricultural supply chain management company. And as part of the senior management team, Chris supported the company's transition from trading-based company to a global agribusiness supply chain management company. Chris Brett is currently our global lead for agribusiness in the World Bank Group. And finally, Parmesh Shah is our global lead for the data-driven digital agriculture at the World Bank. He provides leadership to the bank's work in these areas and supports the development of global knowledge and learning in these areas to offer solutions to clients and other development partners. His current areas of interest are economic and social organizations and networks of the poor, making markets and public services work for the poor, social entrepreneurship, digital and data-based innovations in agriculture and rural development, and promotion of on-farm and off-farm jobs, public-private and people partnerships for rural poverty reduction. He is currently involved in developing a regional program on scaling up digital agriculture in the Africa region, involving setting up ecosystems for entrepreneurship and incubation. He holds a DPhil in Development Studies from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, and a BTech degree in Agricultural Engineering from Pantnagar in India. So I'd like to welcome again our speaker, Peter, as well as our distinguished discussants. And just before I hand over to Peter, just a quick word in terms of the running order and also to ask the participants to start asking questions while the presentations are going on through the chat box at the, when it gets started in the beginning itself. In addition, all participants will get the presentations, recordings, and the curated chat. So we will start with Peter, and then we'll have the discussants for 15 minutes. 3 discussants, each will get 5 minutes. And then we will have open Q&A for about 25 minutes. So let's get started. Peter, over to you.
Hi, Peter. You might stop sharing and then share again. It will come up. Your slide is still kind of, in the process. I'm having a trouble. Jesus Christ. Hello, just.
Okay, we had the first slide up, but I don't see it anymore. Sorry. I don't know about the others, but I'm not getting the audio well either.
Peter, I can share from my end and you can start talking.
Yeah, let's do that, Vivek. I think there are some. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see this now. So Peter, if you can see it, you can please, why don't you go ahead? And can I also ask people, if you are not speaking, to please be on mute?
Peter's machine has hung, so he's restarted it. Give him a few more minutes, 5 minutes maximum.
Okay, my apologies. You can hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear, Peter. Go ahead.
All right.
But
sorry.
we don't see the presentation, Vivek.
Yes.
So let me share my screen now. Sorry about that. My computer hacked.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah. Peter, I'm giving you presenter right.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, great. You can see my screen now.
Yes, go ahead, Peter. We see your screen. Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Shobha, for the introduction. So I'll not repeat too much about myself, but just to share a little bit more. As you heard, Pete and Jonjo, I'm Kenyan. I'm married with 4 kids. Did all my schooling in Kenya. I worked with Coca-Cola for 21 years. And in those 21 years, I had the opportunity of working across the African continent and in different roles. I directly managed about 40 countries. What this did is that it gave me an opportunity to have a first-hand view about the retail structure that we have on the African continent. I got to really understand some of the challenges that you face when you're trying to access the domestic market in Africa. But a little bit now about Twiga and our journey. The way we see ourselves is that, our purpose as a company is to provide affordable access to high quality food and grocery across African cities. And I'll mention why this is important and how this then dovetails into the way we're thinking about the transformation of agriculture. we've grown to about 1,000 employees. And these 1,000, I would say half of them is people that we have on a permanent basis. The other half are on a contractual basis. Key thing is that over the year, we've managed to touch about 60,000 retailers, and I'll mention why that is very, very important. And we have over 1,000 supply partners. Now, of course, just to share a little bit about our journey as Twiga, because I'll not get an opportunity to share this after this, So I co-founded the business 6 years ago, and we've come a long way. We've tried to refine our mission, our purpose, but essentially it's been a very, very interesting journey. From our humble beginnings, we started with just Grant and myself, trying to figure out how to solve this problem that is before us. And at least we've grown to have organizations like IFC be part of our cap table and be very, very supportive of the vision that we're trying to execute, or the purpose that I've called out. So let's first look at the informal retail sector. And I think this is very, very important. The reason why this is important is many a times we talk about producing the food, but at times we don't spend as much time thinking about how will this food get to the people who need it? How will this food get to the consumers? And the thing is that, and I'll explain a little bit why this is very, very interesting, especially around the dynamics that we're seeing with the retail sector and why it remains informal, and why we see the retail sector in Africa continuing to be informal over a foreseeable future. Key thing is that Africa is a fairly young continent. And the thing is that Africa is urbanizing at about 4.2% annually on average. That's 2x Asia, that's actually urbanizing at about 2.2%. But the type of urbanization that we're having on the continent is mainly poor people in the rural areas coming to the urban areas to seek for opportunities. Now, when you're having an urbanization rate of about 4.2%, chances are that the growth in the population in the urban areas will exceed what you call government planning. So what that has meant is that, we've seen an increase in traffic jams, we've seen an increase in informal settlements, and when you put all that together, what happens is that informal retail then steps in to fill in the gaps of how people then access produce. Because what you find is that due to the informal settlements, people don't have cars to travel over long distances. People don't have storage in their homes. So the thing is that what ends up happening is that the informal retail, which is your traditional mom and pop store, then becomes a predominant format in how people access their produce. And you will see what's happening here. Nigeria is about 98% informal. Kenya is about 70% informal. There's a lot of supermarkets that have come up, but again, a lot of instability in the formal retail sector. South Africa is about 40% informal. And what you can see, that informal retail also constitutes a significant part of GDP. In sub-Saharan Africa, this amounts to about $684 billion in value. So the key thing here is, what it looks like is that with the way Africa is urbanizing, with the amount of investment that we're having going into the formal, informal, in terms of urban planning, the reality is that you will continue seeing a growth in informal retail. Just to give you some numbers, in Kenya, over the last 10 years, the number of informal retail outlets has grown by 70%. That's 70%. And when you look at over the last 5 years, 2 of the largest supermarkets in Kenya have essentially failed or about to maybe file for bankruptcy. That way, then there's a lot of volatility on the formal retail. There's this vibrancy that we're seeing in informal retail. Now, this then becomes very critical in terms of how do you access consumers? you can talk about how you're going to farm, how you're going to transform agriculture, but very important is how do you access these consumers? Now, when you have this level of fragmentation, it has an unintended consequence. The key thing is that fragmented retail makes access to food expensive. Why is that the case? You know, when you have markets, for example, South Africa, where you have 60% of retail being formalized, 60% of the South African retail market is essentially controlled by less than 10 retailers. So because of that level of aggregation, it provides a very structured access to the domestic market. Just to give you an example, there's a player in South Africa that controls 80% of the tomato production. Now, you cannot scale agriculture and be that efficient if you do not have a structured way of accessing the retail market. If you look at the UK, you know, only 8% of disposable. Now, in Kenya, that amount is 55% of disposable income goes to food. Just to give you some context, that's the same percentage of disposable income that consumers in the United States were spending on food 150 years ago in the 1870s. So when you think about that, I don't think it should take us 150 years to lower this number from 55% to maybe 10%. And that's why we need to start thinking about innovative ways that we can bring a little bit more efficiency in terms of how food is produced and how food is distributed, because as a result of this fragmentation, there's a lot of waste that goes into the food value chain. Just to give you some context, for example, in Kenya, you're having about 30 to 40% loss in terms of post-harvest losses. That's food that is produced that is perfectly okay at the point of harvesting, but it will never make it to the Kenyan table because it will get lost due to poor handling, multiple handlers, and just poor infrastructure in terms of managing the whole supply chain. So when you put all that together, that leads to a very, very expensive supply chain. And of course, you know, food inflation has been double digit. If you look at most cities, now with COVID, you know, we've seen a unique development where, you know, we've lost certain segments of the market and there's some collapse in food pricing in some value chains. But net, if you look at the last 5 years, we've essentially seen double-digit food inflation across sub-Saharan Africa. So it means that food is actually becoming more and more unaffordable to many residents in the urban cities. Now, the interesting thing is that how much investment is going into agriculture. So just something that's very interesting, you know, we might say that, you know, agriculture employs maybe 70%, 50% of the workforce. I mean, depending on who you ask, there is definitely a significant number of people who are gaining their livelihood from agriculture. Now, over and above that, there is also, agriculture is also accounting for a significant part of GDP. In Kenya, that number is about 30%. But only 2% of commercial finance is going into agriculture. So why is it that you have this sector that's looking very promising, that needs capital to transform production, but yet it doesn't attract capital? And the reason is because when you have a fragmented retail market, then what ends up happening is that you will have a fragmented production. And that fragmented production then becomes a smallholder farmer, because it's the lowest risk way to produce food and service the market, because part of the production is subsistence. But what you're seeing is that very few people are doing commercial farming for the domestic market, which is essentially efficient and actually lowers down the cost of food. So what ends up happening is that this 2% is going to the export-oriented agriculture. These are the agricultural companies in the country that are supplying big supermarkets in the Middle East and Europe. So again, the narrative emerging here is that unless you fix the issue around fragmentation of retail, it then makes it a very risky venture to start doing commercial production of food on a larger scale or on a more efficient scale, like we've seen in markets like in Western Europe and Asia. So, what exactly does Twiga do? Because that's the big question. And the key thing for us is that we feel that we've tried to resolve the issue around aggregation and started to address the modernization of production or agriculture in the markets that we operate. So the key thing is that we look at this in two big tranches. You know, one is on the supply side and the other one is on the distribution side. So on the supply side, the first thing is around fresh produce sourcing. So how do you secure quality, lower cost fresh produce? I just want to give you a little story. Sometime earlier this year, and that was around January, February. So we as Twiga put out an advert in a local newspaper. And what we said is, because the key thing is that, let me first of all talk about the experience that we had with our smallholder farmer base. What happens with the smallholder farmers that we were dealing with is that you have about 15 to 20% very good smallholder farmers. These are smallholder farmers who've invested in their farms, invested in agronomy, invested in irrigation, and they have fairly decent yields, right? Now, when you exhaust supply from that small base, then what you have is a long tail of mainly much smaller farmers who are not practicing agronomy that leads to high yields. They don't have irrigation, and there's a lot of informality in terms of how that farming works. And what happens is that when you then start thinking about building a business that scales, very quickly you realize that after you exhaust the small base of farmers, it's then becoming very difficult for a private enterprise like ourselves to try and build capability that's requisite to get this longer tail of smallholder farmers up to scratch and supplying us on a consistent basis. So we had a lot of frustration, a lot of unreliable supply. And as a result of that, we then put out a newspaper advert in February of this year. And what we said is, look, we're looking for farmers who are willing to invest in 50 acres of land, at least in pieces of land bigger than 50 acres or a minimum of 50 acres. And we want people who can finance those farms for purposes of production. One newspaper advert, quarter page. We got interest amounting to equivalent of 60,000 acres of land of people who actually were ready to self-finance. As a result of that, up until today, we've managed to mobilize about 14,000 acres of the 60,000, which we're working through. And hopefully by the end of this year, we'd have gotten to about 20,000. And this is farms that we've identified that we're developing plans to start scaling in the next couple of months. And that has allowed us to really start aggregating or starting to organize an efficient supply chain around production. But what made that possible is because we had aggregated the retail side of it. And because of that aggregation, it allowed us then to provide a certain set of demand against which we could have production of the fresh produce. Now, and then the other thing is that, of course, we've also gone into grocery. And the reason why we went into grocery is because, you know, as you go and visit the retail outlets, you know, they will say, okay, fine, you're bringing us bananas, potatoes, tomatoes, and the rest of the fresh produce. Can you bring me everything else that I need in my outlet? Can you help me at least stock up my outlet? And for us, then that became another opportunity. So in addition to the fresh produce, and we also started distributing grocery. And this grocery, we realized again that manufacturers were facing the same challenge. Because of the fragmentation of retail, people, especially manufacturers of food, then had to deal with distributors who would then sell to wholesalers, who would then sell to stockists, who would then sell to the retailers, who would then sell to the consumers. And when you think about that long chain, it's very, very inefficient. And what we found is that the same problem that we were trying to solve on the fresh produce side also existed on the grocery side. And that for us was an amazing coincidence, which at least allowed a lot of synergy in the type of model that we're building. And as a result of this, we've started seeing ourselves more and more as a B2B e-commerce player that really helps organize efficient supply chains into those outlets. And of course, there's a piece around payments. You know, there's a lot of technology that, I'm receiving a request to annotate the presentation. Do I approve it? I'm not too familiar with WebEx. I don't know what will happen if I approve this.
Vivek, can you take care of that?
Okay, sorry. Okay. So the thing is that, again, from a payment standpoint, what we did is that we integrated everything that we are doing with mobile money. And this helps efficiency in terms of paying the farmers, being paid by the retailers for produce. So basically, about 90% of our business is transacted through mobile money. Only 10% is transacted through cash. And that percentage is actually coming down significantly. If we look at markets like Kisumu that we just launched in one of the markets in Kenya. The amazing thing is that now 100% of the retailers are actually ordering through the mobile app and paying through the mobile app, which is, again, amazing. And that's a very, very high rate of adoption in 2 weeks. So again, so that's essentially what we're doing on the supply side. Now, a lot of discussions are had around production, but the key thing is that one of the key challenges around distribution. When you think about supplying 60,000 outlets, how do you do that in a cost-effective way if the transaction sizes that's coming through from all those retailers are essentially small? So again, a lot of thought has gone in terms of how we think about warehousing, about how we think about sorting. Just to give you some context, just putting produce in crates when coming in from the farms has significantly reduced post-harvest losses. And that's something that you don't see in the market. So again, starting to invest in very, very basic things just like crates, and this is even without the cold chain, has really helped transform how we actually handle the produce. So again, warehousing for us is a big deal. And right now, we're actually making an investment in the distribution center that would really, really help in terms of increasing the amount of volume that we can then receive, sort, and distribute. And then, of course, there's a piece around distribution. And again, one of the things I know for many of you who've come and visited Nairobi, you've experienced the traffic, you've seen that for yourself. So again, we need to figure out a way to manage distribution while you're working in this type of environment. And of course, the last piece is around customer experience. If I'm a retailer who's not transacting with Twiga, I have to wake up at 4 a.m. every day, go to the local market, buy my produce, and then take it to my shop so that I can stock my outlet. Now, you're transitioning that to a point where a customer now has an app, they can order whatever it is that they need to order, and they receive the product within 24 hours. So again, this then becomes very, very transformational, because as you're sorting out the distribution side, then you can then continue building more capability on the supply side. Now, sorry, let me just go to the next slide. So the key thing is that what retail aggregation does is that it makes food production efficiency possible in Africa. And I'll say why this is the case. So when you think about productivity, you're able to use modern agronomy, you can use scale. And the key thing here is when you think about commercial farming, it's not moving away from smallholder farmers, but it's moving away from small farms. And I just want to at least amplify that distinction. And the reason why that is important is because, for example, when we've started asking for farmers to come up with 50 acres of land, we started seeing people aggregate the amount of land that they have. We've started putting smaller parcels of land and coming up with larger parcels. And this allows us then to start driving a lot of productivity. When you start putting in irrigation, you start putting in modern agronomy, and something as basic as irrigation. You know, this is not fancy, it's not high tech, it's nothing sexy around drones and all. Just something as basic as irrigation, especially when you're having a change in the climate patterns. It's making rain a little bit more unpredictable from a planning perspective. You know, it rains when it's not supposed to rain, and when it's supposed to rain, it doesn't rain. And if you're relying on historical patterns when it comes to production, then you're finding yourself really facing a lot of challenges. So again, the other piece is around post-harvest loss management. And the key thing is that the reason why larger farms are able to manage post-harvest losses is because now you're able to go to one farm and you're able to pick up all the produce, crate it, putting it in a big truck and ship it back to the pack house. So again, this has been a huge transformation for us. And the key thing is that now what we've seen also is that, you know, post-harvest losses have moved from about 35% in the market to just about 5%, which again is a huge transformation from what we've had in the past. The last piece, which I think many of us might not also associate with the impact this has, is around food safety. You know, when you look at, for example, some of the work that we're doing around, and I just also want to thank the World Bank Group through IFC, because right now we've been working basically on a food safety initiative where we're trying to get all our farmers global GAP certified. And that's very critical, because the key thing is that now you can start providing traceability in the food value chain. When you look at some of the produce that is sold in the streets, you know, you really don't know, you know, what type of pesticides were used. Were those pesticides safe? What's the type of agronomy that was applied in growing that? And all these are things that create a lot of uncertainties. And right now, people are worried about what it is that they're taking, because we're seeing an upsurge in non-communicable diseases, you know, cancers and all sorts of other things that are starting to become more commonplace. So again, for us, we really want to get to a point where we can then say that, yes, we're selling our food to the retailer on the street, but that retailer is selling food that meets EU standards as far as minimum residual levels are concerned. And again, I want to just say that, you know, this has been possible because of a partnership that we have with IFC. And when you look at this whole piece around production or commercial farming, again, we have a lot of work that we're doing with IFC in this particular space. Because we got to a point, as I mentioned, where we were faced with a bit of a dichotomy, where it was about, do you solve the smallholder farmer problem? And if you solve the smallholder farmer problem, that's about creating sustainable income for the smallholder farmers. And it's a big problem to solve.
I think so. This is like a ceramic pot.
Pardon? Sorry.
I think someone was not on mute. So go ahead, Peter.
So what I was saying is that, so if you decide to solve the smallholder farmer problem, it's a big problem to solve. It's an audacious goal, but as a company, it takes you in a very different direction. The problem that we've chosen to solve is around food security in urban areas. It's about food pricing, it's about traceability, it's around the cost of food production. And that means that it's more around how do you then get more farmers producing commercially? How do you get more farmers using modern agronomy to improve yield? And by solving that problem, it then takes you in a very different path. And I also want to acknowledge IFC, because together we've been working on a farmer financing facility around transforming domestic food production into more commercial, modern farming. And as a result of that, we're working on a $30 million facility. I know that it's still not finalized, but again, that's just something I just wanted to call out, because IFC and the World Bank have truly been partners in terms of transforming this space. Now, my last slide is, we feel that our model can help transform or streamline food supply in Africa. And this is a $1 trillion opportunity by 2030. And again, that's from data that has come from the World Bank. And this is essentially anchored on 4 pieces. We feel that it starts with lower prices, because consumers are spending more than 50% of disposable income on food. So lower price is a key value proposition. When you have lower prices, you recruit more retailers. More retailers want to be part of your ecosystem because they can source things at a lower price from you at a much higher quality. That then allows them to protect their margins while increasing revenue, because over time, they start passing on the benefits of pricing to the consumers. And that then generates a bit of momentum. And of course, then that leads to the economies of scale, which then leads to efficient production, which is what I talked about when you're thinking about efficient production. When we put all that together, that's really what then gets us to feel that we actually have a solution around streamlining food supply in Africa. So that's it in terms of the slides that I had to share. And now just want to hand over back to Shobha to take us to the next stage.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was a fascinating presentation. I have tons of questions, and we are receiving tons of questions through the chat too. But in the interest of time, let me start with, so we have 3 discussants, as I mentioned earlier. So let's start with Wale Aini. So please stick to the time, because I hope we'll have enough time for an interesting Q&A session at the end. So so let me start with our first discussant. Wale, could you get started, and maybe if you can keep it to 5 minutes or less, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to speak very fast and make it quick here. So thanks, Peter, for that presentation. Very, very good. I mean, you took us through kind of the Twiga story and what you're trying to do. But when you look at Africa per se, beyond formality and informality, there's also like a huge fragmentation issue, right? Africa is 54 countries. In each country, there's a bunch of cities in there. Within each city, there's all these small pockets of people that are really, really small. And with platforms like yourself, what I particularly like is your ability to capture the data, because in the informal market, people tend to be non-existent because people don't know who they are, how much income they make, what they sell. But what we've seen with aggregation platforms like yourself is that you're now able to start collecting data around that very, very informal market. And maybe the one question I'll pose to you, which is a great opportunity, is that with your platform, you are on one end capturing a lot of data about informal retail and who all these folks are, how much they spend. And on the other side, you're capturing a lot of data about the farmers and what they sell as well. So beyond core food security, and what are the other opportunities that platforms like yourself can provide? Because I think that data in everything is very important. In venture capital is also very important in anything of scale. So once you capture all that data, what opportunities do you see down the road that you can start servicing that informal sector? Maybe that's financing, insurance, healthcare, and how are you making sure that that's one part about opportunity, but also on data security? Because as you capture data about those people on your platform, how are you making sure that data is safe, is private, and is only used to the advantage? I think those are 2 key questions that I think would be good to elaborate about how you see the opportunity, but also how you think about the responsibility around the data you're starting to capture about the informal sector.
Great questions, Wale. Peter, maybe we'll get the other 2 discussants to speak, and then maybe you can address the issues that they've raised before getting into the general Q&A. So let me pass on to Chris Brett. Chris, over to you, and if you could also please keep it short so we can have enough time for a discussion with Peter. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Shobha. Yeah, I'll keep it short. Peter, I just want to say what a great presentation. I really love the entrepreneurial spirit, and really you brought your learnings from that formal work and environment you did at Coca-Cola into this space. And I'd like to share with you all the challenges I've had on setting up food businesses in Africa as well. I've done a lot of work in Nigeria myself. I was there 11 years, and it's a huge challenge to actually build these networks and build what you're doing. So when I look at your presentation, I think it's really interesting where you've placed yourself within this system. And I always think it's great to have learnings. And for me, I think one of the biggest takeaway, I've never heard of the expression before of aggregating retail. I've always heard of aggregating farmers, aggregating, all the production side. And I think, you've really, really found that spot on space where there's that huge across Africa, these informal traders, these informal markets, this informal retail. And I've never thought of them really at the retail. And I think, a little bit more definition about to you what a retailer is. I think it's really important. The other thing is just sort of challenge you a bit, in your responses, going forward in this dialogue. In your slides, you've got, this contractual arrangement with smallholders. I mean, at the bank, we're very challenged on what does that mean? Is it actually a contract, or is it sort of a formal agreement? Is it agreement of trust? We help you, you supply us, and of course, the trust is very critical because of the risk of really investing in farmers on side selling, particularly food, the kind of space you're in. And I really appreciate that. That's a real difficult area. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more, what you consider about that area. I think the other thing is, I like the way that your business is diversifiable, if that's a proper word. I mean, the way you've gone in some core staples and products, then you've branched out into the groceries and so on. I mean, your model is really interesting. It's nimble, it's light, it's adaptable. But I think the last question I'd come to you, and then I'll stop on this, Shobha, because I know there's loads of things I could ask you, and I'd love to have a sideline discussion with you at some point, Peter, is really this business of payment of farmers, because you're, on your system, you're talking about this electronic, this data, this payment. When it comes to produce from smallholders, how are you verifying the quality? It's really difficult to exist purely on trust. Is this a grade A product? I'll pay you this. Is it grade B? Is it correct? Because a lot of farmers obviously will mix product. Product is degrading quite rapidly in some of these circumstances before they get into the good, before they get into really good aggregated agri-logistic models. So I really understand it. How do you actually verify the payment that the farmer has given you the produce that you've really wanted? I think that's really key. And of course, the World Bank, in the space that Shobha and I and the team are, we've spent, decades working on production and sorting out quality and so on. And we're still challenged on many, many things. And I think the last point is just to say that working on these aggregated land models, I think, is really key. In places like Tanzania, we've seen a huge growth into commercial medium-sized farm. It's not all about the large-scale farmer. It's this development, this evolution from smallholders either coming together or smallholders evolving into medium-scale production. And at the medium level, you become commercial, you become a real procurer of input, you become an investor, and you really invest in your markets. So I think it's really great. So back to you, Shobha. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Okay, Parmesh, over to you. And if you could also please keep it to 5 minutes or less, that would be great.
Sure. No, thanks a lot, Peter, for an excellent presentation. I think it clearly shows the potential of data and digitization. If you just take the retail part and the consumer interface, you have been able to affect a lot of significant change. My question was that Kenya has about 100 very mid-size or small-size farmer organizations, which are trying to become like SMEs. And this is particularly more in the dairy sector. You can see clearly a lot what is happening, and the people aspiring to have new kind of consumer brands and products and things like that. So are you looking at a collaborative model where already farmer organizations have aggregated the product to some extent? And then if you could do a kind of a digitization platform with these 100 aggregators who are already aggregating, probably you could, expand your business model even faster. So do you think there are any problems in working with existing farmer organizations or producer organizations which have already aggregated? Because we are investing in those organizations because we would like them to become eventually some kind of SMEs over a period of time. And so what do you see as the potential of working with that? The second question is that, do you see any role for public sector and the World Bank's investment in public goods on the warehousing and logistics side? Can we work on some kind of a public-private model so that even the number of warehouses which are modern, efficient, data and digital driven is low in many parts of Africa, including Kenya? So is there a role for World Bank to facilitate more investment into those kinds of warehouses? Because I think if warehouses were available, a lot of produce will get in and more quality produce might be available. So I would love to have your thoughts on that. And then in order to get an end-to-end digital and data-driven platform, which has producers, the logistics, the retail, and the consumers, what is the kind of investment in that ecosystem look like? And is it going to be done by innovators and entrepreneurs and the government just has to make good policies to get out of the way? Or can it make some investments to reduce the initial cost for a private investor not going to have to work on the back end, finance and everything? So what are your suggestions about developing that end-to-end digital ecosystem there? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Padmesh. Peter, and you have a lot of good questions from our discussants, and let me add a couple to that, and then we can also get into a Q&A. No, I think it was fascinating the way the way the Twiga model works is, where, as Chris also mentioned, you're looking at it from the consumer perspective, right? So, and you're looking at, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? It's really, if you can make a dent in that 55% and knock it to down, say 40%, so that frees up another 15% for additional consumption in other sectors. So we want to knock it down, further and further down to about 10%. So which, I think that's the sort of the key behind what the Twiga model is all about. And I remember you telling me that, bananas and potatoes were the carriers, while the other produce were the passengers. It was the first time I've heard sort of carriers and passengers being used that way. And I was wondering, a couple of things. One is, the potential for having more, more of these carriers rather than just the passengers. And, what does that depend on? Does that depend on these, public sector investments, as Padmesh mentioned, on the public goods side, like irrigation, which is still extremely low in Kenya overall, right? So, and my last question then would be that, just given the history of retail in Kenya, you've had two big supermarkets that have failed. So do you see how do you see the future? Do you see a future where it is all going to be on platforms like yours, or do you see the sort of supermarkets also coming in? But, I suppose that also depends on the nature of urbanization in Kenya. But I'd be interested to know what you think about, the future of supermarkets, in Kenya and other parts of Africa. So let me stop here. I think you have loads to answer. So Peter, over to you.
So thank you so much. I'll try and be very efficient because this is quite a handful. So I'll start with the first question, which was around use of data. Just to give you some context, right now as it stands, we have about 20 million rows of data, when we think about our database. That's from the time when we started Twiga, which was 6 years ago. But now, every month, we're adding a row of data. We're adding about 1 million rows of data. So our data generation is actually growing exponentially. And what this is doing is that it's starting to give us quality information that we never had before. Just to give you some context, for example, in the new city that we just launched, Kisumu, in another 3 weeks, we're going to transition all the retailers in that city to start buying with a 7-day overdraft, which over those 7 days, they only pay about a 1% interest. And that's essentially being charged by the bank. When I compare that to the microfinance lending that's available in the market, the option right now that you have is a financial product by Safaricom, where every transaction has a 7.3% transaction fee. So when you think about it from that perspective, the data that we have is starting to attract banks who want to start lending on our platform using our wallet. And that for us is a huge, huge opportunity, because then now we can actually use fintech as something that starts to create affinity of retailers to our platform. Second thing is, we're working with one of the larger insurance companies, Britam, and we're trying to figure out a daily insurance product where you pay about 7 US cents per day. And this then gets you to have about $300 of fire insurance, about $400 of burglary, and about $1,000 of inpatient cover for the retailer. Because again, them being hospitalized is one of the biggest drains of working capital, where they have to then divert their working capital to pay for hospital bills. So when you start thinking about the amount of data that we have, this then starts generating very, very interesting use cases. And we're seeing possibilities that we can actually partner with a myriad of partners in terms of providing those services. The second question was around data security. And I just want to share a real life example. This was 2 weeks ago. We had a cybersecurity attack where we had somebody breach into our platform, deleted all the data, and then demanded ransom in Bitcoin. So the thing is that in an hour, we were able to restore all our systems and actually improve on the security, and life continued. Many people in the organization did not even know what happened. And the key thing for us is that cybersecurity then is becoming something so critical in terms of people wanting to breach the system and actually take the data that we have for other purposes. And the key thing is that, because of legislation in Kenya, for example, the Data Protection Act, it then becomes very important of how we need to ring fence the data of our customers and ensure that that data is used for the right purpose. So again, these are things that we're continually investing on. And the key thing is that security now is a major, major investment for us when we think about our IT stack. So then the next question was around contracting with farmers. And what we actually do with our farmers is that we actually have a formal offtake agreement. And the key thing is that what we found is that when farmers are beyond a certain amount of acreage, they then start respecting offtake agreements a lot more than farmers with small acreage, where they can use the product between subsistence and commercial. The reason why I say that is because one of the biggest challenges that you have with offtake agreements is something we call side selling. We try to partner with Safaricom, where they have this initiative they call DigiFarm, where they have a lot of farmers, very, very small farmers, forming part of the ecosystem. And, we gave a purchase order to DigiFarm, and, they struggled to supply the order. Why was that the case? It's because they had a contracted price. At the point where we made the order, there was a bit of a spike in the price in the market. So all the contracted farmers actually went out and sold their product in the market, and left the person who had put together everything, carrying a lot of risk in terms of even advanced cash that was actually put into their farms. So the key thing is that if you're going to do offtake agreement, ensure that the farms are a little bit big, where the person then sees the risk of not having guaranteed offtake and views the fact that if I were to honor this contract, I'm better off in the long term. Because the key thing is that at times farmers will want to side sell when the prices are very high, and then they want to stick into the contract when the prices in the market collapse. And the key thing that we tell our farmers is that there are good days and bad days. We're there for you on both times. But the key thing is that we need to think about our relationship on a longer term basis as a way to address this element around side selling. And that's one thing that actually makes offtake agreements not work in many of these markets. The second question was around payment of farmers and around quality verification. So the thing is that we pay our farmers 24 to 48 hours after harvest. So we don't do it in real time. The key thing is that the reason why we do that is for every harvest that we make on the farms, we actually have Twiga employees who are harvest coordinators. These are people who will then come to you and say, okay, through a digital platform, farmers are able to book a harvest to then say, by the way, my bananas will be ready for harvest in 3 days, in 4 days, in 5 days. And we're able to plan that out for a month. And that allows us in a very systematic way to know which farms are harvesting and where we need to go. And because of that information, what happens is that our harvester then goes on site, is able to harvest, their produce is created, and then it's shipped to Nairobi. So we have a two-step verification process. We have the verification of the harvester when the product leaves the farm, and then we have the verification of the warehouse once the product is received. And once those two tie, the farmer payment is then queued on the platform. The next day they receive their money on mobile money. So again, very, very efficient, but again, there's a two-step verification process. So then there was the other question that was asked, which was around, smallholders evolving into commercial farming. Definitely, I think that there is room for some of these smallholders evolving into commercial farms, but a lot of it is around the capability building that you have. For example, in Tanzania, I think there's forget the name of the company. I think Silver something. It's actually a producer. It's actually a fund based in London. It's a primary agriculture fund of $200 million that is investing in SADC, Silverlands. So what Silverlands do is that they've been investing in what you call nucleus farms or nuclear farms. And these nuclear farms are essentially large farms that then mobilize a community around to have like an extension of a production. As a result of that, if you look at places like southern Tanzania, this has actually transformed potato production. And just to give you context, even in a period where Kenya has a lot of potatoes, it's cost effective to actually ship potatoes from the southern part of Tanzania into Kenya. That's 1,300 kilometers. And because the quality of produce is so high, you only have about a 2% loss post-harvest due to transportation. When you cannot get that in Kenya, because in Kenya you're having issues around the quality of agronomy material and so much, because the thing is that there has not been some very, very significant, what I call private sector involvement in terms of trying to transform some of the value chains, for example, potato seed and all, which essentially is what Silverlands is doing. Today, we're actually getting a lot of our potato seed from Silverlands in Tanzania. So it's not that Tanzania has transformed agriculture materially, but you've actually had a lot more significant investment in primary production going into Tanzania. It's the same thing with onions in the northern part of Tanzania, where you have a 2,000-acre onion production facility. So again, all these things then start making a transformation in the general ecosystem when you look at farmers. Then the other piece is, the other question was around working with aggregators, where, existing farmer organizations are put together. The thing is that, we very early on in our history, we worked with what we call farmer cooperatives. And our experience with them was not very wholesome, which made us skew the other way to actually work with farmers directly. And the way we then work with these organizations is to say that, look, if you've been organized into a community or into a cooperative society, that's great. Enjoy the benefits of a cooperative society, but we will contract with the farmers individually. We will pay you individually. If you feel that the cooperative is so valuable to you, then pay your subscription. And the reason why we had to do that is because some of these cooperative societies, you would then pay the money into the account, but then you start having a significant amount of money going into administering the whole structure. So you're having now officials sitting in the cooperative society, and you start incurring all sorts of overheads. And what's happening now is that part of the farmer incomes are going to subsidize the organizations or the structures that have been put in place. So what we then say is, and then what we found is that there was then a lot of politics because you'll find that most of the officials in some of these producer organizations are more enlightened people, maybe who've worked in the urban areas and are going back to the rural areas, so much higher level of education. And then bulk of the farmers who are part of a cooperative society are less enlightened and do not have the confidence to even question some of the things or some of the decisions being made at a cooperative society level. And what we saw is that we don't want to get into that type of politics, because what it does is that it starts distracting us from our real objectives. So we prefer to work directly with the farmer. But again, if there are aggregations of farmers that have been done differently, definitely happy to look at that and explore that and look at basically what is paid into the cooperative society and how much money then goes to the farmer. So then there was the next question, which was around public sector investment and in public goods like warehousing. So I think the key thing is that I would say that if I look at public sector investment, there's a couple of pieces around infrastructure. The reason why this is important is because if you look at a business like ourselves, maybe in India, and there's so many comparables in India, what you find is that in Africa, sometimes because of a lack of infrastructure, you have to invest in the intellectual property that goes towards solving your problem, while at the same time, you have to try and create an enabling environment to support your own business, because the infrastructure or the public infrastructure is essentially not there. I just want to give you an example. Like in the case of maybe if I'm starting a fresh produce aggregation business in Latin America, chances are I'm able to get a good warehouse with a raised platform. I can get somebody who can actually kit out the warehouse and do it for us on a lease basis. That doesn't exist here. So when I look at, for example, our new distribution center, we're spending slightly over $10 million investing in infrastructure. So the key thing that I'm asking myself is, if I were to have somebody who's able to invest in some of this infrastructure, then the capital that we raise, we can then use that to actually grow the business rather than acquire some of these assets. And when you look at some of the assets that we have in our markets, some of it is very expensive. For example, I don't know whether, paying $70 per square foot of warehousing space is a global norm, or essentially we're paying through an arm and a leg in this part of the world. So when you start seeing numbers like those, and it starts telling you that there is a shortage of some of this type of infrastructure that essentially is becoming a barrier to a lot of the good work that people want to do. So I'm thinking about mainly things like warehousing. And then I think as a segue into that, the next question was around the digital platforms. What kind of investment needs to be made? I think the key thing is that from a digital standpoint, I think that's something that's best invested in by private sector. Players like ourselves and others in the market can actually come out here, put together the software and the logistics to put all this together. But I think, things that would make a huge transformation is things that, the heavy lifting that maybe private sector might not be able to engage in on a profitable basis, because then that's a bit more longer term. For example, how do you aggregate smallholder farmers, provide them with irrigation so that they can actually produce at a competitive level of productivity? You know, what investment do you then need to make in terms of upping the level of capability that you have with smallholder farmers? Or, you know, some of the aggregation centers, if going and collecting produce from all these smallholder farmers is not viable for a private sector enterprise, how does public money then come in and say, you know what, we're going to create these aggregation centers? They may not make money 6 months of a year, but the key thing is that it starts scaling commercial production of food in those little neighborhoods. So again, I think that's the type of infrastructure that would be having the best impact. And then, of course, private sector then plugs into that type of infrastructure. So then the next comment was essentially around the potential for having more products being commonplace. And I think this is what we're calling basket variability. And I think, Shoba, just going to your question around, you know, the what I'd call the high velocity type of products vis-a-vis the lower velocity type of products, you know, where you look at the carriers and the passengers. And the key thing is that the Kenyan food basket, actually the bulk of the consumption is fairly narrow, right? So if you're to look at, for example, the food balance sheet in Kenya, if you went to the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and I think the last time they did a detailed balance sheet of what a Kenyan eats on a yearly basis was in 2018. And if you go and look at that balance sheet, you know, potatoes, tomatoes, onions, watermelons, and bananas account for about 70% of consumption. Just those 5 products. You know, everything else, you have a long tail. And this is around fresh fruits and vegetables. And the key thing is that when you're out there in the market, you can see it. If you go to any stall on the side of the street, you will find tomatoes, you will find onions, you will find bananas, you'll find watermelons and potatoes consistently. Then the rest, you know, it will be sprinkled. You know, you'll get some oranges, but not consistently. You'll get some mangoes, not consistently. So the key thing for us is, or the way we see it is, if we think about how we want to scale production, we don't want to spread ourselves too thin. We want to look at these 5 products and really focus on lowering the cost. Of course, when we go into another market, you will find that the basket will change. For example, we're thinking of going into a market like Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. Now, the staple in West Africa is acheke, which is a byproduct of cassava. It's made from cassava. So very, very different diet from what you have in East Africa. So the whole idea is fish where the fish are. Look at what is being consumed and double down on making those value chains efficient. If you do that, the potential of you impacting the cost of food then becomes much, much higher than spreading yourself too thin, because spreading yourself thin means that you're complicating the agronomy side of things, or you're actually stretching yourself much, much farther. And then the last question was around the future of retail. And this is very interesting conversation in terms of where I see retail heading on the continent. The thing is that I think there will be a place for modern trade, or I think there will be a place for supermarkets. But supermarkets will not take over the way they took over retail in the US or in Western Europe. And the reason why that is the case is because of the way the cities are developing. As I mentioned, you're having a 4.2% rate of urbanization, and the rate of urbanization is much, much higher than infrastructure spent by government into those cities. So when you look at that, you will always have this segment that continues to be unplanned, which will be a significant segment. which means that there will always be a place for informal retail. So what I see is that, there will be players like us who will then start aggregating that informal retail into a B2B commerce type of play. And we started seeing that happening in other parts of the continent. You have companies like Marks AB in Egypt that are doing something very similar to us. You have Trade Depot in Nigeria doing something very, very similar to us. And we feel that, that will be the engine that really then starts bringing the informal retail into the digital age. And of course, once you've had the aggregation of informal retail, then there's so much that you can do, for example, from the B2B2C standpoint, because you then have this captive audience of informal retailers, you can then start offering different value propositions to consumers using that as maybe a distributed inventory model. So again, there's a lot that can happen in that space, but I feel that with the informal retail, there will be technology innovation that takes us into a very different direction, and you will continue having modern retail. And then, of course, there will always be a space for the traditional B2C e-commerce, for example, like Jumia. But I don't think the likes of Jumia is what you will then see becoming very, very wide scale, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So I hope at least that kind of gives you a flavor on the questions that you asked.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. We have a lot of questions from the audience, so let me pick up on a few of them. One question was when you talked about, sort of aggregating farmers, what are the systematic, let me take maybe 3 questions. What are the systematic hurdles in Kenya to actually combining small farms to make large farms, because you would need to target sort of the larger farms. And then a second question is on the, I think you've talked a little bit about the traceability and the quality control. But I think the issue here is how do you maintain this traceability and quality control? And also, are you facing sort of specific challenges now that you're going in, specific distribution challenges now that you're going into processed foods like cooking oil and unga and rice? And then somebody had a question about you mentioned the traffic. How do you make sure that Twiga delivers on time given the traffic issues, or do you envisage a decentralized decentralized distribution centers? Sorry, one last question, because I think this is an interesting one from Jane, who is actually a contract farmer on a parcel of approximately 25 hectares who produces for export, but she's not utilized her entire parcel. And now she's keen to expand to crops that will do well in her area, like potatoes, cabbages, cauliflower, broccoli, etc. She's self-funding, but her biggest concern is access to markets. And what tips and advice would you have for Jane? So let me stop here. I'm not sure if we can get through all of the questions. Apologies to those who have submitted the questions, but this has been a fascinating presentation. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'll start with the first one in terms of the hurdles that we face when we're combining smallholder farmers. What I would say is that this doesn't succeed everywhere, and that's why for us is that it's not something we lead with. For example, the farmers that have come together and are able to do this is in a place called Kibwezi, and that's towards the coast. Population density is much lower. The parcels of land are slightly bigger, so it's easier for farmers to then say, we're coming together, we're having off 60 acres together, and we're giving you this for purposes of working through a distribution or production plan. The reason why this is not feasible in most places is because, and I'll tell you what, if you take a satellite image of Kenya, and you draw a line from maybe the northernmost border with Uganda, and then you draw it all the way to the southernmost border in the coast with Tanzania, the lower half of Kenya is basically forested, good vegetation, good rainfall, and very, very good for arable production. The north is barren. Now, the challenge is that we all live on the arable side. That's where you have the highest population density. So what's happening is that if you look at suburbs like Kiambu, which is very close to Nairobi, agricultural land is starting to give way for real estate. So the thing is that trying to get large parcels of land to do farming in those types of urban areas is next to impossible. So the key thing is that, there are areas in the country where this is feasible and there are areas where it's not feasible. But what you find is that there's definitely large chunks of land that are arable and are easy to commercialize. And that's why if you look at, for example, the 60,000 acres of pipeline that we identified, bulk of that is arable land with single owners. So again, when you're looking at an average anywhere between 50 acres to 200 acres. So the second question was around traceability and quality control. And of course, the distribution challenges as we moved on to grocery. So the key thing for us is that, a lot of the farmers that we have, we're investing right now in global gap certification, having continuous evaluation of those farms to ensure that once they get certified, they can stay certified. So again, there's a lot of continuous improvement that we have on those farms. And that's why for us, you cannot do this if you have 17, 20,000 farmers. The number of farmers that we have will need to decrease so that we can now start working on bigger pieces of land, and then we can have the resources to actually start investing in the quality control that you can get from those pieces of land. Because right now, when you look at, for example, some of the services government used to provide, like agronomy, agronomy extension services, those things don't exist anymore. So again, that's why you're finding that for us being a private enterprise, we have to then work with fewer farmers with larger pieces of land. And then of course, the distribution challenges as we moved on to grocery, or we moved out of fresh. I would say that that for us, we're doing very well. So the thing is that I came from an FMCG background. So this is an area that I understand very, very well. And for some of these commodities, we are now the largest distributor in the country. So, and we've done that in a space of about 15 months. So again, there's just significant opportunity. When you start eliminating waste, the opportunity to scale is fairly significant. Then the third question was around managing traffic and distribution. And what we have found is, you cannot rely on a centralized distribution model. That's just not practical. So what we have is, we have 3 layers of distribution. So we have the distribution center. The distribution center is a large piece of infrastructure that will be the nerve that actually supports several depots. That type of distribution center, we're going to have it in Nairobi for now, because that's where we have bulk of our products being distributed. The distribution, then next to the distribution center, then you have what we call a fulfillment center. And the fulfillment center is essentially still sizable warehouses, not to the scale of a distribution center, but located in major cities. So if I look at it, for example, we'll have a distribution center in places like Thika, Machakos, Kisumu, and as we expand into all these new cities, we will have a fulfillment center, which is a smaller version of a distribution center. And then below that layer are small depots. And these depots are strategic centers of availability where we run a hub and spoke model from a distribution standpoint, which means that you're taking product there, and then that product is distributed in a very, very hyper-local area. That type of layered structure allows us to then penetrate these markets with a very low cost of distribution. Otherwise, if you're to do everything from one location, traffic, distances, and all that, you'll end up running a very, very inefficient production. And then, of course, the last question was around access to market for farmers. And one thing I would say is that The reason why access to market is difficult is because it's fragmented. For example, if I'm a farmer and I'm looking at, how do I access the market? The key thing is that, Nairobi is about 6 million people being fed by 180,000 retailers. When you have that level of fragmentation, it then becomes very difficult for you as a farmer to then grow product and then start distributing to those smaller types of places. So what I would say is that if you have 25 acres, you want to grow high value crops like cauliflower, broccoli, your best bet is to start developing partnerships or supply partnerships with the formal retail. That's the supermarkets or the formalized greengrocers, because then the range of product that they serve is much, much wider, because they're actually serving a very more affluent type of consumer. But for folks like ourselves, essentially it's things that are lower value, high volume, and things that you need to grow on a large scale for you to actually start making for it to make financial sense for you as a farmer.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think we'll take one more round of questions. We still won't be able to get to all of them, so let me pick three. So one question from a participant is, how will your larger target farms be able to effectively control diseases such as the Panama disease that affects bananas, and what does Twiga do to help the farmers with that? Second question on, is there a danger of Twiga becoming a monopoly and crowding out other retailers, or do you see enough space for more Twigas in the Kenyan ecosystem? And third, I think as you mentioned, irrigation can be quite a game changer in the Kenyan agriculture context. Other than the Safaricom platform that you mentioned, is Twiga doing anything in terms of providing access to finance for farmers to be able to invest in other inputs? So after these three questions, I think we will probably call this to a close. And I want to thank the participants and Peter for his patience. So it's the last round of questions, Peter, before we close. So I know we've gone 5 minutes over, but maybe another 5 minutes to get these last questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So so how will we work with larger farms to control disease? And I just want to give an example of our largest banana farm right now and how we've actually managed this dynamic. So the key thing is that, and Panama disease was called out. So let me just deal with the banana value chain, because then that's very specific to the Panama disease conversation. The thing is that a plantation of bananas do not have genetic diversity. So it means that, you're having one more or less like a genetic blueprint across the whole plantation, which means that if disease comes from one side of a plantation, it's very easy for it to move across the whole plantation and actually affect the whole crop. So one thing that we have done is around you never have a very large plantation, but what we do is that we actually divide this into blocks. And the reason why we divide those into blocks is actually to reduce access into those farms. And what we do is that by limiting access, then it means that there's a single point of entry and exit when you're getting into the farm, and where, for example, you put a food dip, where at least when you come in, you can disinfect your shoes before getting into the plantation. The reason why we take that type of precaution is because we understand that as we start moving to larger farms, the susceptibility to disease becoming a big issue is much higher. So we then think about that in the design, and which is part of a global gap process, especially for the banana farms. The smallholder farmers are protected from some of these dynamics due to the mixed varieties that they grow. When we started Twiga, we were thinking initially around exporting bananas to places like the Middle East, where there was a huge shortage of bananas. And the importer in the Middle East said, you know what, I want a giant Cavendish variety. So you go to the farmer and you're like, hey, by the way, I want a giant Cavendish variety. They're like, okay, I don't know what that is, but I got this from my cousin. And then this I bought when I went for a farmer exhibition and all. And what you find is that there's such variety in terms of the mix on their farms. And that kind of sometimes naturally protects some of the smallholder farmers against some of its diseases that you have. And then also there's no irrigation and there's no mix in the ecosystem because everything is in small separated pieces of land. So again, it'll come from how we design our large farms, how we think about controlling access to some of these farms, and just general hygiene that you have on the farm. So the second question is there a danger of Twiga becoming a monopoly and crowding out the retail? I would say that, if that ever happens, it will not be by design. But the key thing for us is our vision or our objective as a company is to then say that, do we see ourselves reduce the cost of food from 55% of disposable income to maybe even 45%? Because what happens is that if you're able to then inject that 10% back into the economy, that's consumers starting to spend in other categories. When Americans are only spending 10% of their disposable income on food, that 90% can be seen in the rest of the economy. It creates new sectors, new industries, new types of jobs, new opportunities for growth. And I think that's essentially where we would want to see ourselves moving our countries to. So I think the key focus for us is how do we then work with the ecosystem to play a part in lowering the cost of food. If there are other players in the market, well and good, and we've seen other players come into the market, and it's a huge market. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we will never control a $684 billion market. The key thing for us is that we want to operate in cities, and when we play in those cities, we want to have a meaningful impact. We're not too keen on driving a lot of expansion into rural areas at this point. Our focus is around urban cities. And then does Twiga provide inputs to farmers, other types of inputs? Right now, for example, on things like potato seed, we're actually providing the inputs to farmers. The reason why is because we've seen that unless we start investing in some of those inputs, farmers actually don't have a way of accessing them, or you're not able to secure them. So we're providing a lot of seed financing to our farmers. And now with partners like Amiran, we've actually started doing a lot of projects around irrigation, where Amiran, who's a partner to Twiga, already has a fund that they've managed to access to invest in irrigation infrastructure, and they're able now to put that across to some of the farmers that we're working with. Generally, our model is around, we want to build a platform where you can have different types of stakeholders plugging at different points and together creating an ecosystem that lowers the cost of food and also makes it cost efficient in terms of how we distribute the food.
Thank you so much, Peter. Actually, one final question. What percentage of Kenya's consumers now are using digital platforms to purchase food? And have you seen a real spike since COVID, compared to your baseline? And is it just mainly sort of the digitally aware in Nairobi, or are you expanding to the other tier 2 cities as well? And that is the final question. Thank you for your patience.
So I would say that, in Nairobi, we basically have what you call a legacy business. So the legacy business means that there are people who started on the offline and they've more or less stuck to that because it's what they know. There are people who are actually moving to the online space. So it's a bit of a blend. But we did an experiment in Kisumu. And what we then said is, we're only going to have one ordering mechanism, and that is going to be either online or the call center. We're not going to have salespeople going around and taking orders. We're just going to use them for account development. And we've been operational in Kisumu in 14 days. And what we did is that when we looked at the warehouse where we launched, we then said, look, we're actually going to take like a 5-kilometer radius from our warehouse. We're going to focus on the customers who are in that particular 5 kilometers and try to see how many customers we can convert. In 14 days, we actually have 50% of the customers within that 5-kilometer radius ordering from Twiga. And we started seeing a lot of repeat orders coming through from that market. And all this is with zero intervention of the salespeople, which means that now customers are getting more comfortable actually ordering from their mobile phones. And I think that for us has been a huge realization. And as we expand to other cities, we want to drive mobile fast. We want to say to customers in those cities, if you want to engage with Twiga, get a smartphone, and let's get to the lowest prices in the market. And that value proposition really then starts getting people to then invest in the technology that they need to then interface with us. So that for us has been very, very encouraging and a very, very eye-opening development, at least in our fast market. And the key thing is that you can then tell that, a lot of the customers in that market are really excited with, because it looks like magic when you kind of get into some of these rural areas where I get onto my phone, I click on a few things, then somebody shows up with the stuff the next day. They're like, wow. So
I still feel that way. So
yeah.
Yes. No. Thank you so much, Peter. This was a really fascinating discussion. I want to thank you for your time and your patience. And I hope to be able to see you again in person very soon when I visit Kenya next. I'd like to thank all our panelists, Wale, Chris, and Parmesh, the discussants for their very insightful questions and comments. And of course, to all of our participants who stayed on patiently, thank you all for your excellent questions. And again, thanks to Peter and his team for a really wonderful discussion session. So I'm signing off now. Have a good day, good evening, wherever you are, and stay safe.
Shobha, can I announce the next webinar?
Oh, yes,
okay with
please,
you?
yes.
So,
I was supposed to do that.
I think please tune in on October 15th for a seminar by the CEO of eFisheries, IoT smart feeding technology to really build very quality products in aquaculture in Indonesia. It's going to be another exciting one like the Peters today, where we will get a very new initiative in Indonesia, which is bringing IoT technology on number of fishery producers in Indonesia. Thank you very much, and good evening, good morning, good night.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity, permission, Vivek. Okay, bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Peter.
Thanks.
Bye.